"For you to conceive, you must receive a holy seed that breaks the curse," he said with a smile that masked his wickedness. Confused but desperate, Martha fell for his lies. What followed was a betrayal of trust as Ezekiel preyed on her innocence.
Welcome to Folktales of Africa with T-bwoy. Kindly subscribe to our channel, click on the notification bell, and please like our videos. Thank you.
Pastor Ezekiel arrived in the small town of Asafo with a grand proclamation. He was a man sent by God to bring blessings, miracles, and prosperity to the people. With his charming smile, eloquent speeches, and elaborate white robes, he quickly became a sensation. People from neighboring villages flocked to Asafo to witness the wonders he promised to deliver. The church he established, named Divine Path Ministries, grew overnight. Ezekiel claimed to have direct conversations with God, convincing the people that he had the power to heal the sick, restore broken homes, and unlock financial blessings. What they didn't know was that Ezekiel was not the man of God he pretended to be. Behind his holy facade lay a dark and sinister agenda. The people of Asafo were desperate. Years of economic hardship and social unrest had left them vulnerable and eager for any glimmer of hope. Ezekiel knew this and exploited their desperation to enrich himself. Every service was a spectacle, filled with promises of miraculous breakthroughs for those who gave generously to the church. The congregation, desperate for a better life, emptied their pockets, believing their sacrifices would bring divine blessings. Pastor Ezekiel was a master manipulator. He knew that to maintain control over his congregation, he had to build an aura of unquestionable authority. He began by creating an environment of fear and dependency. He preached fiery sermons about the dangers of disobedience to God's chosen servant himself. Anyone who questioned him was labeled as an agent of the devil, silencing dissent before it could take root. Ezekiel also introduced a system of spiritual rankings within the church. Members who gave the most money or devoted the most time to the ministry were publicly praised and given special titles. This created a culture of competition where people felt pressured to outdo each other in their offerings and devotion. Those who couldn't keep up were made to feel unworthy, driving them to sacrifice even more in the hope of earning God's favor. One of Ezekiel's favorite tactics was the prophetic seed. He would tell the congregation that God had revealed a specific amount of money they needed to sow as a seed to unlock their blessings. "God is telling me that 20 people here must sow a seed of 100,000 cedis each," he would declare, and people would rush forward, desperate not to miss their chance at a miracle. Pastor Ezekiel's Sunday service was legendary for its miracle sessions. Every week, the church was packed with thousands of desperate people seeking divine intervention. The sick, the jobless, and the heartbroken all gathered, convinced that Pastor Ezekiel held the key to unlocking heaven's blessings. Unknown to his congregation, Pastor Ezekiel's miracles were nothing more than carefully staged performances. Before the service, his assistants would comb through the crowd, identifying potential targets for the healings. They would approach individuals and engage them in casual conversations, gathering details about their lives and struggles. Armed with this information, Pastor Ezekiel would appear to miraculously reveal these details during the service, leaving the crowd in awe. During one service, Pastor Ezekiel dramatically called out a woman named Martha. "Sister Martha, God has revealed to me that you have been struggling with a mysterious illness for 5 years. Martha's jaw dropped in disbelief. How could he possibly know this? The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Pastor Ezekiel laid his hands on her, commanding the illness to leave her body. Martha, overwhelmed by the atmosphere and the expectations of the crowd, fainted on the spot. The congregation erupted in praise, convinced they had just witnessed a miracle. But the truth was far from divine. The so-called miracles were nothing more than psychological manipulation and theatrics. Martha's fainting was a result of her heightened emotions and the overwhelming energy of the crowd, not any supernatural power. Pastor Ezekiel knew how to exploit the vulnerability and desperation of his followers, keeping them hooked on the illusion of his divine authority. Behind the scenes, Pastor Ezekiel had a secret weapon that amplified his charisma and influence over his followers: charms. These were no ordinary trinkets but objects imbued with spiritual powers obtained through dark rituals. Ezekiel's closest confidant, a self-proclaimed spiritual advisor, had introduced him to these charms early in his career. They were said to grant him persuasive abilities, enhance his aura, and make him appear larger than life to his congregation. Ezekiel's favorite charm was a small, intricately carved amulet he wore beneath his robe. He believed it gave him the power to control the minds of his followers, making them obedient to his every command. During services, Ezekiel would often hold the amulet tightly as he spoke, feeling its supposed energy coursing through him. The charm gave him the confidence to deliver fiery sermons that left his audience spellbound. But the power of the charms came at a cost. Ezekiel's spiritual advisor had warned him that to maintain their potency, he needed to perform regular sacrifices. These sacrifices ranged from the slaughter of animals to more sinister acts that Ezekiel chose to ignore until the time came. The congregation, oblivious to the source of Ezekiel's divine powers, continued to worship him as a man of God. They brought him gifts, money, and unwavering loyalty, believing that their sacrifices would secure their blessings. Ezekiel, now addicted to the influence his charms provided, became more ambitious in his schemes, exploiting his followers without a hint of remorse. As Ezekiel's church grew, so did his greed and reliance on the charms his spiritual advisor had given him. One day, his advisor warned him that the power of the charms would begin to fade unless he performed more potent rituals, ones that involved human sacrifice. Initially horrified, Ezekiel rejected the idea. He told himself he could maintain his influence without crossing that line. But the pressure to maintain his miracles and his congregation's unwavering devotion weighed heavily on him. Soon, Ezekiel noticed a decline in his miracle performances. His charisma didn't seem as strong, and the congregation wasn't as responsive. Some members even began whispering doubts about him. Terrified of losing everything, Ezekiel turned to his advisor, who once again insisted that human sacrifice was the only way forward. The first victim was a childless widow who often stayed behind after services to clean the church. Ezekiel convinced himself that she would not be missed. Under the guise of inviting her for a private prayer session, he lured her to a quiet and private room late one night. There, he carried out the ritual, suppressing his guilt with the belief that he was doing what was necessary to maintain his divine mission. The next Sunday, Ezekiel's performance was electrifying. The congregation marveled at his renewed energy and the supposed miracles that followed. He felt both happy and trapped. He knew he had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. After the dramatic healing services, Pastor Ezekiel began to single out certain members of his congregation for special prayers. He would carefully select vulnerable individuals, widows, single mothers, or families dealing with sickness or financial struggles. He justified these private sessions as necessary steps for higher spiritual intervention. One evening, a young mother named Beatrice approached Pastor Ezekiel for prayers concerning her sickly son, Jacob. The pastor, with his usual charm, promised her a complete transformation but warned, "The power of God works in mysterious ways. You must trust the process, no matter how unusual it may seem." Beatrice, desperate to save her son, agreed. Ezekiel instructed her to bring Jacob to the church after midnight for a secret ritual. On the fateful night, the pastor performed a bizarre ceremony, chanting in a language Beatrice could not understand while sprinkling what he claimed was holy water. At the end of the ritual, Ezekiel told Beatrice to leave Jacob in the church overnight. "The angels will work on him while you rest," he explained. Trusting his words, Beatrice went home. However, Ezekiel had other plans. Unknown to her, Jacob was used in one of his sinister rituals for power and offering to the dark forces Ezekiel secretly served. The next morning, Beatrice returned to find her son looking pale but awake. Ezekiel assured her it was part of the healing process, but in truth, Jacob's soul had been tampered with in ways that could not be undone. From that day, the boy's behavior changed drastically. He became withdrawn and fearful, haunted by nightmares. The congregation continued to see Ezekiel as a man of God, oblivious to the dark forces at play. However, whispers of unease began to spread among a few observant members who noticed inconsistencies in his actions. Pastor Ezekiel's fame had grown, and with it, his arrogance. He now claimed that God had given him the divine ability to unlock destinies for those who sought his touch. Women, in particular, became the prime targets of his deceit. One Sunday, during his service, Pastor Ezekiel announced, "There are women here whose wombs have been cursed by the enemy. But fear not, for the Lord has anointed me to break these curses and bless you with children." The congregation erupted in cheers, and many women rushed forward, kneeling before him and crying for their wombs to be opened. Ezekiel laid his hands on them, muttering prayers with exaggerated theatrics. But behind the scenes, his plans were anything but divine. Among those who sought his help was a young lady named Martha. She had been married for 6 years without conceiving a child. Her in-laws had branded her barren, and she was desperate to prove them wrong. Pastor Ezekiel singled her out, declaring, "Your breakthrough is near, but you must come to my office for private counseling and prayers." In his office, Ezekiel manipulated Martha's vulnerability. "God has revealed that your husband's bloodline carries a generational curse. For you to conceive, you must receive a holy seed that breaks the curse," he said with a smile that masked his wickedness. Confused but desperate, Martha fell for his lies. What followed was a betrayal of trust as Ezekiel preyed on her innocence. Weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant and thanked the pastor profusely, not realizing the true nature of what had occurred. Word of Martha's miracle spread, and other women flocked to Ezekiel, each manipulated into believing in his so-called divine mission. The cycle of exploitation deepened as Ezekiel used fear and hoped to control his congregation. Pastor Ezekiel's mansion was no longer just a residence. It had become a fortress of mystery. His trusted inner circle of elders and prayer warriors were sworn to secrecy about the unusual activities within its walls. Rumors began to spread about late-night gatherings where screams and strange sounds were heard. One of his most trusted aides, Brother Emmanuel, had begun to grow uneasy. Emmanuel had been with Ezekiel since the early days of his ministry and had believed in his vision wholeheartedly. But the longer he stayed, the more he witnessed things that contradicted the very faith Ezekiel claimed to preach. Late one night, Emmanuel overheard Ezekiel speaking with a mysterious man dressed in a dark robe. "The sacrifices must continue if you want your power to grow," the man said coldly. Emmanuel froze. His heart raced as he realized the pastor he had idolized was involved in sinister activities. Ezekiel responded with a wicked grin. "I have done everything you asked. My church is full, my bank accounts are overflowing, and the world respects me. What more do I need to sacrifice?" The robed man's answer was chilling. "The higher you rise, the greater the demand. Innocence carries the highest price." Emmanuel couldn't bear it anymore. The weight of his conscience was too heavy. He decided to leave the ministry, but before he could, Ezekiel summoned him. "Brother Emmanuel, you've been loyal to me," Ezekiel said with a piercing gaze. "But loyalty has its price. Are you prepared to stand by me, no matter what?" Emmanuel stammered, "Of course, Pastor. I have always been loyal, but deep inside, he knew he could no longer stay silent. That night, Emmanuel packed his belongings and fled, vowing to expose the truth. But Ezekiel's reach was far and wide. The next day, the church announced that Emmanuel had gone on a mission trip abroad. No one questioned it, but Emmanuel knew he was now a marked man. After Emmanuel's sudden disappearance, Ezekiel felt a tinge of unease. His ministry was thriving, his influence unmatched, yet he knew that cracks were forming beneath the surface. The facade of holiness he had built so meticulously was starting to show signs of wear. One Sunday morning, during a packed church service, Ezekiel performed another of his miracles. A wheelchair-bound woman was brought forward by her family. The congregation watched in awe as Ezekiel prayed over her, loudly rebuking the spirit of infirmity. With dramatic flair, he commanded the woman to rise. Slowly, she stood up and took a few hesitant steps before collapsing into Ezekiel's arms. The crowd erupted in cheers and praise, convinced they had witnessed the hand of God. But behind the scenes, it was all a carefully orchestrated act. The woman had been paid handsomely to play her role. She wasn't sick or disabled, but had been recruited to maintain the illusion of Ezekiel's divine powers. Among the congregation that day was a journalist, Grace Okoro, who had been investigating the church for months. Grace had heard whispers of fake miracles, financial exploitation, and even darker allegations. She watched the miracle unfold with skepticism, noting every detail. Her gut told her this was yet another performance meant to deceive. That evening, Grace reached out to one of the church's former members, a young woman named Sarah. Sarah had left the church after being manipulated into an abusive relationship with one of Ezekiel's inner circle members. Through tears, she recounted how she had been promised blessings and protection in exchange for her silence about the things she had seen. As Grace Okoro delved deeper into her investigation, she uncovered a troubling pattern. Pastor Ezekiel's miracles, financial schemes, and even his personal relationships all seemed to be built on a web of deception. Her sources whispered of a private room in Ezekiel's mansion where rituals and other questionable activities allegedly took place. Determined to expose the truth, Grace devised a plan to infiltrate one of Ezekiel's private prayer sessions, which were held exclusively for wealthy and influential members. These sessions, known among insiders as Nights of Glory, were advertised as opportunities to receive direct blessings from God. Tickets to these sessions were sold for exorbitant amounts, and attendees were sworn to secrecy about what transpired. Grace posed as the assistant to a prominent businesswoman interested in attending one of the sessions. After a hefty donation, she secured a spot. When the night arrived, she entered Ezekiel's mansion, her heart pounding. The air was heavy with incense and murmured prayers. A group of about 20 people, all clad in white, sat in a circle as Ezekiel stood in the center, holding a staff adorned with strange carvings. As the session began, Ezekiel spoke in a commanding voice, claiming he could see visions of each person's future. He called individuals forward, one by one, to lay hands on them and prophesy. Grace watched intently, noting the vague nature of his predictions. Most were general statements that could apply to anyone, yet the attendees seemed fascinated. Midway through the session, Ezekiel suddenly turned to Grace, his piercing gaze locking onto her. "You," he said, pointing his staff in her direction. "There's a heavy burden on your spirit. Come forward and let me cleanse you." Grace's pulse quickened. She hadn't anticipated being singled out. Gearing herself up, she approached him. As he placed his hands on her head, she felt a strange sensation, like static electricity. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I know you're not who you claim to be," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But be careful. You don't know the forces you're playing with." Grace froze, unsure whether he was bluffing or truly knew her intentions. She returned to her seat, shaken but determined to continue her investigation. Grace was rattled by her encounter with Pastor Ezekiel, but knew she couldn't stop now. She delved deeper, reaching out to people who had distanced themselves from the church after dubious experiences. What she uncovered was far worse than she imagined. Human sacrifices for power, abuse of young women under the guise of spiritual cleansing, and the exploitation of vulnerable members for wealth. Grace interviewed a former aide of Ezekiel, a man named Stephen, who revealed the extent of the pastor's dark practices. "I used to think it was just miracles and blessings," Stephen admitted, trembling. "But I saw things. Human blood spilled for power. I saw charms hidden beneath the altar where he preaches." Stephen also described how Ezekiel lured women into his chambers, pretending to perform spiritual rituals to rid them of family curses. These sessions often led to abuse, and many young women were left broken and abandoned. Ezekiel's victims included teenagers who were coerced into silence with threats and intimidation. Determined to expose the full scale of Ezekiel's operations, Grace collaborated with local authorities and human rights organizations. They devised a plan to raid the mansion during one of the nights of glory, ensuring they had enough evidence to bring him to justice. On the designated night, Grace waited anxiously outside the gates with a team of law enforcement officers. As they stormed the premises, the once revered pastor was caught red-handed conducting one of his so-called rituals. The room was filled with strange symbols, blood-stained objects, and frightened followers who had no idea what they had become part of. Ezekiel tried to resist arrest, shouting that he was untouchable because of his divine calling, but the evidence was undeniable. The officers confiscated documents, charms, and recordings that detailed years of deceit and exploitation. With Pastor Ezekiel in custody, the community erupted in a mix of shock and outrage. Many of his loyal followers couldn't believe the man they had revered for years was capable of such atrocities. However, others, particularly those who had suffered in silence, came forward to share their stories, strengthening the case against him. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see justice served. Testimonies from Ezekiel's victims painted a horrifying picture of manipulation, abuse, and greed. Grace's investigative work played a pivotal role, as her findings provided crucial evidence that exposed the extent of his crimes. The judge sentenced Ezekiel to life imprisonment for his numerous offenses, including fraud, abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. His conviction sent a strong message to other fake pastors who preyed on vulnerable people. In the aftermath, Grace dedicated herself to helping the victims rebuild their lives. She partnered with nonprofits to provide counseling and financial support to those who had been exploited. The church was closed down, and its ill-gotten wealth was seized and redistributed to fund community projects. As Grace reflected on her journey, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. While it had been a dangerous and emotionally draining mission, she knew she had made a difference. Her story inspired others to question blind faith and demand accountability from religious leaders. In the end, the community began to heal, embracing a new era of transparency and integrity. Grace's work reminded everyone of the importance of vigilance and courage in the face of evil. Advice: faith is a powerful force, but it must be guided by wisdom. Always question what doesn't feel right, and never be afraid to seek the truth.
Please subscribe to the channel, like and share our videos. Thank you.